Imagine a train so fast it strapped on actual jet engines from a B-36 bomber. Imagine another that tilted into curves like a motorcycle decades before bullet trains. Imagine locomotives so revolutionary that engineers refused to believe the numbers and railroads buried them in scrapyards before history could catch up. Between 1950 and the year 2000, brilliant engineers built machines that should have changed everything. Instead, they were forgotten, scrapped, and erased. Today, we resurrect 10 of them. Stay till the end. Number 10. The Fairbanks-Morse H2466 Train Master. Our journey begins in April 1953, when a relatively small builder called Fairbanks-Morse rolled a monster out of its Beloit, Wisconsin plant. They officially called it the H2466, which stood for Hood Unit, 2,400 horsepower, 6 motors, 6 axles. The world simply called it the Train Master. When it was introduced, the Train Master was the most powerful single-engine diesel locomotive on the market. Nothing else came close. EMD's flagship at the time was producing only about 1,750 horsepower. The Train Master almost doubled that. Inside its long hood sat a unique 12-cylinder, 2-cycle opposed piston prime mover. A design where 2 pistons faced each other inside a single cylinder and met in the middle to compress the fuel. It produced 112,000 pounds of tractive effort and rode on a pair of 3-axle tri-mount trucks. The Train Master could replace 2 4-axle locomotives in many services. Norfolk and Western and Virginian Railway used it to drag heavy coal trains through the Blue Ridge Mountains. Southern Pacific tried it on commuter trains in the San Francisco Bay Area. The Wabash sandwiched a Train Master between 2 F7 locomotives, using its raw muscle to push their high-priority freights across the prairies. So why was it forgotten? Quite simply, the Train Master was too much too soon. Many railroads thought 2,400 horsepower in one unit was excessive and were reluctant to commit. The opposed piston engine was complex to maintain. Fairbanks-Morse was a small builder competing against the giant EMD. By 1957, production ended, and Fairbanks-Morse left the locomotive business entirely a few years later. Yet the Train Master was the direct ancestor of the high-horsepower hood units that would re-dieselize North America in the 1960s. It was, quite literally, 15 years ahead of its time. Number 9. The General Motors Aerotrain. 3 years after the Train Master rolled out, General Motors decided to save the entire passenger railroad industry. The Aerotrain was unveiled in 1955 and entered service in February 1956 as a wild experiment in lightweight, low-cost, streamlined rail travel. The Aerotrain was the brainchild of Harley Earl, GM's legendary vice president of styling, with the actual design handled by Chuck Jordan, who would later create the 1958 Corvette. 2 demonstrator train sets were built. Each consisted of a streamlined locomotive called the EMD LWT-12 and a string of 10 passenger cars. The locomotive used the same 12-cylinder 567C engine found in the SW1200 yard switcher, producing just 1,200 horsepower. The passenger cars were essentially GM intercity bus bodies bolted onto 2-axle railroad bogies. They were only 40 feet long, exactly half the length of a normal passenger car, and they were built from aluminum to save weight. The original promise was bold: speeds over 100 miles per hour, New York to Chicago in just 10.5 hours, and a price per seat half that of a traditional streamliner. The Pennsylvania Railroad ran one set as the Pennsy Aerotrain between New York and Pittsburgh. The Union Pacific tried the other as the city of Las Vegas, with Liberace himself in the engineer's seat for the inaugural arrival in December 9. But the Aerotrain failed almost immediately. The 1,200 horsepower locomotive was severely underpowered. It needed helper locomotives to climb grades like California's Cajon Pass. The bus-derived air suspension delivered a notoriously rough, jarring ride at high speed. By 1958, GM gave up and sold both train sets at a loss to the Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific Railroad, which used them in commuter service until 19. Today, both demonstrator locomotives survive, one at the National Railroad Museum in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and one at the Museum of Transportation in St. Louis. The Aerotrain failed, but its idea, lightweight semi-permanent train sets, would later be vindicated by Japan's Shinkansen and France's TGV. Number 8. The Krauss-Maffei ML-4000. In 1961, Southern Pacific and Denver and Rio Grande Western took an enormous gamble. They imported 6 locomotives from West Germany, built by a company called Krauss-Maffei. These were the ML-4000 diesel hydraulic locomotives, and they looked unlike anything else on American rails. Where every American diesel used electric traction motors to drive its wheels, the ML-4000 used a hydraulic transmission. Inside each locomotive sat two 16-cylinder Maybach MD-87 engines, each producing 2,000 horsepower at 585 RPM for a total of 4,000 horsepower per unit. Power flowed through Voith hydraulic transmissions and drive shafts directly to the axles. The cab sat high in a turret-like structure on top of the car body, and the trucks were unique German 3-axle designs. The advantages were real. Hydraulic drive gave full tractive effort from a standing start with no traction motor wheel slip. There were no traction motors to overheat or short out. Maintenance was, in theory, simpler. SP and Rio Grande each took delivery of 3 units, and SP later ordered 15 more road switcher hydraulics that arrived in 19. But North American conditions destroyed the ML-4000. The high-revving Maybach engines were brutal on themselves. Drive shafts kept failing. Maintenance ended up far more demanding, not less. Rio Grande gave up after just 3 years and sold its 3 units to SP in February 9. SP soldiered on, running the KMs over Donner Pass and the Tehachapi's, but by November 9, only Southern Pacific No. 9-110 survives today, having been rebuilt into a film camera car. The ML-4000 was a brilliant German design that simply could not survive American freight service. The diesel hydraulic concept was decades ahead of its time, and on the rails of Europe it remains alive and successful to this day. Number 7. The Alco C-855. The American Locomotive Company, or Alco, was once the second largest builder of diesel locomotives in North America. By the early 1960s, they were losing the war to EMD and General Electric. Union Pacific gave them one last shot at glory, and in 1964, Alco swung for the fences. The result was the C-855, and at the moment it was built, it was the most powerful single diesel locomotive ever constructed. Each C-855 unit packed 2 16-cylinder Alco 251C engines with a combined output of 5,500 horsepower on a single frame. The locomotive rode on 4 2-axle trucks linked by span bolsters, an arrangement called BBBB. Only 3 units were ever built, 2 A units numbered 60 and 61, and a single cables B unit, number 60B. Together they could provide a staggering 16,500 horsepower on a single train. Union Pacific assigned the C-855s to the overland route, where they pulled some of the longest, heaviest freights between Wyoming and Nebraska. They were experimental from day one, intended both as turbine replacements and as a way for Alco to prove it could still play in the major leagues. But the same problem that doomed every twin-engine locomotive haunted the C-85. When one engine failed, you lost half your locomotive. The C-855 suffered from chronic reliability problems. Alco's electrical systems, supplied by GE, were never quite tuned for the dual-engine setup. The complicated drive arrangement caused constant headaches in the shop. Union Pacific stuck with them less than a decade. By 1971, all 3 units were retired. None were preserved. Alco itself exited the locomotive business in 1969, just 5 years after the C-85 was built. This trio of monsters represents the last gasp of one of America's greatest locomotive builders, a brilliant engineering swing that came up short. Number 6. The New York Central M497 Black Beetle. In the spring of 1966, Alfred Perlman, the president of the New York Central Railroad, called engineer Don Wetzel at the railroad's Collinwood Technical Center near Cleveland. He gave Wetzel a wild assignment: build a jet-powered train, and do it in 30 days. What Wetzel and his team produced was the M497, nicknamed the Black Beetle by the press. They started with an existing Bud Rail diesel car, a self-propelled commuter unit called an RDC-3, and stripped out its diesel power plant from the equation. Then they bought 2 surplus General Electric J4719 jet engines from the U.S. Air Force for just $5,000. These were the same engines that had served as booster pods on the giant Convair B-36 Peacemaker bomber. The engineers mounted the jets on top of the rail car at a 5-degree downward angle, which created downforce to keep the car pinned to the rails. Wetzel's wife Ruth, a commercial artist, designed the streamlined black nose cowling that gave the Black Beetle its name. On July 23, 1966, on a long, dead-straight stretch of normal track between Butler, Indiana and Stryker, Ohio, the Black Beetle thundered down the rails. It hit 183.85 miles per hour. That number remains the official American rail speed record for self-propelled rail vehicles. It has stood for nearly 60 years. Despite the spectacular success, jet-powered trains were never seriously pursued for commercial use. The fuel consumption was insane, and the jet exhaust was deafening. The Black Beetle's J47 engines were eventually removed and bolted to a Conrail snowblower, where they happily melted ice for years afterward. The rail car itself was returned to normal service and was eventually scrapped. But the data Wetzel collected proved that conventional American track could safely handle speeds that nobody had thought possible. The M4097 was a wild publicity stunt that quietly opened the door to the high-speed rail dreams that came afterward. Number 5. The Bud Metroliner. In 1965, the Japanese Shinkansen had just demonstrated to the world that real scheduled high-speed rail was possible. The United States, watching nervously, passed the High-Speed Ground Transportation Act, and the Pennsylvania Railroad placed an order with the Bud Company for 61 high-speed electric self-propelled cars. They were called Metroliners, and they entered service on January 6. Each Metroliner was an electric multiple unit, meaning every car had its own traction motors and drew power from the overhead catenary. The cars had a design top speed of 160 miles per hour. They were built from stainless steel by Bud at their plant in Red Lion, Pennsylvania, and they used cutting-edge propulsion systems developed jointly by General Electric and Westinghouse. They had reserved business and first-class seating, dining cars, lounges, and a level of comfort that genuinely competed with airline travel for the first time in American history. In testing, a Metroliner reached 164 miles per hour. In service, the trains were limited to 110 miles per hour because of the condition of the track and signals, but they still slashed the New York to Washington trip to under 3 hours. They were enormously popular with business travelers. Within 2 years of launch, half of all Metroliner passengers had switched from airplanes or automobiles. The Metroliner brand became so iconic that Amtrak kept using it after taking over Northeast Corridor service in 19... But the cars themselves were plagued by reliability problems. At many times, less than 2/3 of the fleet was actually serviceable. Multiple expensive overhauls in the 1970s failed to fix the issues. By 1981, Amtrak quietly demoted the original Metroliner cars to slower routes and replaced them with locomotive-hauled trains. Most were eventually rebuilt into unpowered cab cars. The Metroliner brand disappeared in 2006, replaced by the Acela Express. The Metroliner cars themselves were the spiritual ancestors of every American high-speed train that followed, even though they never quite delivered on their original 160-mile-per-hour promise. Number 4. The UAC TurboTrain. While Penn Central was launching the Metroliner, another train of the future was being unveiled by United Aircraft Corporation. The UAC TurboTrain debuted in late 1968, and it was unlike anything else in North America. It looked like an airliner stretched out on rails, complete with a high turret-style cab. 2 train sets were built for the U.S. Department of Transportation by Pullman Standard, and 5 7-car sets were built for Canadian National by Montreal Locomotive Works. The TurboTrain had 2 revolutionary features. First, it was powered by gas turbines, specifically modified versions of the Pratt & Whitney Canada PT6, the famous turboprop aircraft engine. Each power car carried multiple ST6 turbines, with up to 6 turbines in some configurations. Second, the TurboTrain had passive tilting suspension, which allowed it to lean into curves at up to 7 degrees decades before such systems would become common worldwide. The numbers are still astonishing today. On December 20, 1967, during a test on the Pennsylvania Railroad's main line between Trenton and New Brunswick, New Jersey, a TurboTrain reached 170.8 miles per hour. That remains the world speed record for a gas turbine-powered rail vehicle, unbroken to this day. In Canadian service, a turbotrain hit 140 miles per hour near Gananoque, Ontario in 1976, but the turbotrain was rushed into service after only a year of testing, when most trains receive 6 or 7 years. On its very first demonstration run in December 1968, the turbo collided with a truck at a level crossing near Kingston, Ontario. The tilting mechanism was a maintenance nightmare. The 1973 oil crisis destroyed the economic case for gas turbines. Amtrak pulled the U.S. trains in 1976. Via Rail kept the Canadian sets running until October 31, 1982, Halloween night. None of the 7 train sets were preserved. Every single one was scrapped. The turbotrain's tilting technology and articulated car bodies, however, directly influenced Bombardier's later LRC trains and informed the studies that eventually produced Amtrak's Acela. Number 3. The British Rail APT-E. While North America was experimenting with turbines and jets, Britain was about to leapfrog them all. In 1972, British Rail rolled out something genuinely revolutionary at their research centre in Derby. It was called the APT-E, the Advanced Passenger Train Experimental. The APT-E consisted of 2 driving power cars and 2 trailer cars, all built from aluminum and connected by articulated bogies. Each power car carried 4 Leyland 2S350 gas turbines, originally designed for trucks, plus a 5th turbine for auxiliary power. The turbines were initially rated at 300 horsepower each, later uprated to 350 horsepower. But the real magic of the APT was its active tilting system. Unlike the passive tilt of the turbotrain, the APT used hydraulically controlled active tilting that could lean the car body up to 9 degrees into curves. This meant the train could safely take existing curves at speeds 30 to 40% higher than a normal train, all without making passengers feel sick. It also had hydrokinetic brakes, a sort of water turbine retarder system that allowed the lightweight train to stop within existing signal block distances, even from extreme speeds. The APT-E made its first run on July 25, 1972, from Derby to Duffield. On August 10, 1975, it set a new British rail speed record of 152.3 miles per hour, a number that the production prototype APT would push even further to 162.2 miles per hour in December 1979, a British record that stood for 23 years. But the APT project was a victim of its own ambition and bad luck. Politics within British Rail, union disputes, the press eagerly mocking every tilt failure, and the eventual decision to focus on the simpler but successful HST Intercity 125 all conspired against it. The full production APT-S squadron fleet never happened. The single APT unit now sits at the Locomotion Museum in Shildon. Yet APT technology lived on, licensed to Italy's Pendolino, and ultimately bringing the tilting concept back to Britain decades later in the Class 390. Number 2. The GE U-50C. Union Pacific's love affair with massive locomotives produced one of the most ambitious and most flawed designs of the entire diesel era. Between November 1969 and November 1971, General Electric delivered 40 of these monsters to Union Pacific, numbered 5000 through 539. They were called U-550Cs, and they used the same UP specification that produced the famous EMD DDA-40X Centennial. Each U-50C was 79 feet long and crammed 2 12-cylinder GE FDL prime movers onto a single frame, with a combined output of 5,000 horsepower. The trucks were salvaged from UP's retired 8,500 horsepower big blow gas turbine locomotives, 3-axle designs that gave the unit a CC wheel arrangement. To save weight, GE engineers made one fatal decision. They replaced traditional copper electrical wiring with aluminum cabling. The U-50C was supposed to be the answer to UP's need for high-speed, high-horsepower freight power. On paper, it was magnificent. In practice, it was a rolling disaster. Aluminum cables overheated. Electrical fires became routine. Unit 50112 caught fire in early 1975 in one of the worst incidents. The cast truck frames developed stress cracks. The 12-cylinder engine suffered from chronic low oil pressure. Cooling water leaked. Dynamic brake grids melted down on grades. Union Pacific even rewired one unit with copper as an experiment, but found that fixing the entire fleet would cost more than the locomotives were worth. A business downturn in 1976 finished the U-50Cs off. All 40 were withdrawn from service, and during a 1978 coal miners' strike, 5 of them were temporarily used as stationary power generators, their final indignity. Every single U-50C was scrapped between 1977 and 1978. Not one survives. They were the wildest combination of high horsepower, weight savings, and recycled turbine parts ever attempted, and they paid the price for being too radical too fast. Number 1. The EMD SD90MAC-H. We end our list at the very edge of the 1950 to 2000 window, with a locomotive that was supposed to define the 21st century, and instead became one of the most spectacular failures in modern North American railroading. The EMD SD90MAC-H entered the catalog in 1995 as Electromotive's bid to win the so-called horsepower wars against rival General Electric. The SD90MAC-H was built around an entirely new prime mover called the EMD 265H, a 4-stroke, 16-cylinder turbocharged engine producing 6,000 horsepower. That made it the most powerful single-engine production diesel locomotive ever built. It rode on 6 axles with AC traction motors and EMD's brilliant HTCR2 radial steering trucks, which actually let the wheel sets steer themselves into curves. The cab was isolated on shock absorbers to reduce vibration for the crew. The locomotive was 80 feet 2 inches long and weighed 425,000 pounds. On every spec sheet, it looked like the future of railroading. The reality was a catastrophe. The 265H engine simply was not ready. Crankshafts failed, cylinders cracked. The cooling system, which EMD had guaranteed to handle the heat output, repeatedly overheated and shut down. The early units had to be shipped with the older, more reliable 16-710G engine instead, producing only 4,300 horsepower. These were redesignated SD943MACs, with the option to be converted to full 6,000 horsepower units later, an option that almost no railroad ever exercised. Of the 478 SD90 family locomotives built before production ended in 2002, fewer than 70 ever received the actual 265H engine. Only Union Pacific and Canadian Pacific bought them. By 2005, EPA Tier 2 emission rules killed the locomotive completely. The 265H was never certified. Norfolk Southern bought 100 ex-Union Pacific SD9043MACs and rebuilt them into something completely different. Canadian Pacific did the same. Today, almost no original 6,000 horsepower SD90MAC-Hs remain in service. The dream of a single-engine 6,000 horsepower diesel locomotive died with this machine. Modern North American freight trains use multiple smaller locomotives instead. The SD90MAC-H was not just ahead of its time. It was so far ahead that the technology to actually make it work simply did not exist. EMD had reached for the future and grabbed empty air. If you enjoyed this video, smash that like button. Subscribe for more deep dives into the most incredible machines ever built. And tell me in the comments which one of these forgotten giants deserves a second chance. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next track.